has a long history of being put to use on planet Earth for a wide variety of purposes. The Mesopotamians used it in the creation of jewelry and mosaics as far back as 3100 BC. Egyptians employed oil in the embalming of mummies in 2600 BC, and Greeks used it as fuel for lamps around the same time. The Babylonians were known to apply oil to their boats as a form of waterproofing, and in the Western world, oil's first major use was in the creation of kerosene for lighting. Indeed, oil has been and continues to be the world's most sought-after commodity, which seems to have a limitless number of uses. One of the earliest and biggest producers of oil for industrial use was Baku in Azerbaijan. In fact, the world's first mechanized oil drills were built and employed there in 1847, and primitive wooden ships built to transport it also debuted in the region, the world's first oil tankers. By the early 1900s, Baku had become the #1 oil-producing region on the planet, and some of the first oil baron families from Europe, the Rothschild and the Nobels, owned the majority of the fields in the area. We shall keep Baku in mind as we delve into one of the unfortunate but nonetheless vitally important uses for oil: to operate and maintain the machines of war. Oil has played a central role in a variety of conflicts throughout history, but perhaps none greater than World War II, where both American oil superiority and fierce Russian defense of the oil fields in Baku led to Hitler's defeat at the hands of the Allied forces. World War I was one of the first industrialized conflicts, and oil allowed the creation and operation of tanks, planes, ships, and other means of weaponized transportation, in addition to mortars, bombs, and pretty much everything we now consider to be a part of modern warfare. In World War II, oil was a key component in the German blitzkrieg style of attack, a method that involved rapidly storming enemy territory with tanks, planes, mortars, and troops on the ground before adversaries had a chance to gather their wits and formulate a counterattack. This required a tremendous amount of fuel, and as the war dragged on and oil reserves became scarcer, the Germans were forced to focus on acquiring more oil before they could continue their aggressive advance. On the Allied side, the American petroleum engineers were the first to formulate 100 octane fuel for aircraft. This gave their Spitfire planes a massive advantage over German and Japanese fighter planes in terms of maneuverability, speed, and torque, and thus led to a dominance previously unseen in air-to-air combat. World War II was largely won due to American oil supply advantage, and when Hitler realized this, he altered course in Russia, and against all his advisors' recommendations, was set on capturing the great oil fields of Baku instead of focusing on more strategically advantageous targets in the short term. He knew that if new reserves of oil were not captured, he could never win the long game. And in what would be his final major effort, his advance was halted in the treacherous and difficult to navigate Caucasus Mountains, where Russian troops adept in the terrain were able to outsmart and outfight the Nazi forces, thus cutting them off from much-needed oil and spelling the beginning of the end for Hitler's dreams of world domination. War. War never changes. And in the myriad of conflicts that have erupted all over the globe since World War II, oil has often been at the center of these conflicts, whether as a fuel that could provide a strategic advantage in combat, or as a source of energy that nations desire to advance their societies and gain a technological advantage in times of peace. One cannot discuss the history of oil without mentioning the rise of the automobile. In fact, the invention of the first cars and their later widespread adoption may have saved the oil industry in its early days, when its wide range of uses was not yet known. The 1950s in America saw a major boom in the oil industry, driven by the automobile, and the West's rising obsession with oil became a full-blown addiction. Between 1945 and 1950, the number of cars on the road in the US jumped from 26 million up to 40 million. This new era of cars for all enabled the suburban lifestyle we know today, by allowing people to move further away from city centers thanks to the convenience and speed of transportation provided by these early gas guzzlers. And guzzlers they were. Fuel-inefficient muscle cars with 400 horsepower V8 engines caused the use of gasoline to skyrocket, and for a time, the American dream revolved around fast cars with no signs of slowing down. Things did slow down, however, and by the time America realized that its growing dependence on foreign oil reserves was becoming an issue, it was already too late to react. Massive amounts of imported oil began entering the country in the 1960s, and when the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, placed an oil embargo on the US in 1973, there was panic at the pumps, as massive gasoline shortages rocked the nation. This spilled over into the 1970s and 80s, causing economic woes that deeply affected society across the board. To remedy the situation, the US was able to intervene in the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq in 1991, under the pretense of protecting democracy. The ensuing Gulf War saw American forces engage in widespread bombing of Iraqi targets, along with the now famous Operation Desert Storm ground assault, and after the conflict was largely resolved, a steady supply of oil to the West was secured at reasonable prices. You know, in the name of freedom. Remember what I said about war never changing? Commodity Culture is a series that covers the history and culture surrounding commodities and natural resources. If you enjoyed this episode and want to see more, please subscribe and hit the bell notification to ensure you are always alerted of the latest episodes.